Welcome to In All Honesty, the podcast where we get real about life and all the problems that come with it. I'm Michelle Elman, and I'm that friend who we all know is a little bit too honest. You might not come to me when you get back together with your ex, but I'll be there for you when it all goes tits up. Welcome back to In All Honesty, and today is a topic that I'm not sure I have actually ever spoken about in depth. I think I have said a number of times throughout my entire career that I have PTSD, which is post-traumatic stress disorder. I actually have complex PTSD, so C-PTSD, which is usually like a repeated number of events. But largely my PTSD comes from my medical trauma. So for those of you who don't know, which is probably none of you left, I've had 15 surgeries before the age of 19 from a brain tumor, a punctured intestine, obstructed bowel, a cyst in my brain, and a condition called hydrocephalus. I had about 5 surgeries when I was up to years old. I had 1 surgery at 7. I had about 5 surgeries at 11. I had 2 surgeries at 19. And if you add those numbers together, I am 99% sure they don't add up, but it definitely totals to 15. I got diagnosed with PTSD when I was 20 years old, and this is the part I'm not sure I've ever spoken about. So just before we get into the episode, I will be talking about things that are probably traumatic. I am not going to put in details that are triggering in any way. I may talk about some of my symptoms, but that is probably as detailed as I am going to get. And if any of this is uncomfortable, this probably isn't the episode for you. But as I say, I'm going to do it in quite a surface level way. And I'm quite conscious of what tends to be triggering, and I'm going to be staying away from those topics. So the moment in which I was diagnosed with PTSD, what had happened previously was, for a little bit of context, it was in my 3rd year of university. My last surgery was in my 2nd year of university. I had had 1 surgery to remove my adenoids and tonsils because I had glandular fever really badly. I had done that right before New Year's, and then about 3 days into my recovery, I had left hospital. 3 days later, went out to go celebrate New Year's belatedly, and I was out in a club and then was like, I have a really bad stomach ache. Was convinced it was either food poisoning. I hadn't drunk a lot, so I was like, it's definitely not that. I had like a sip of alcohol, and then ended up in hospital again, and I ended up staying in hospital for 6 weeks. I then panic rushed out of hospital out of fear of losing all my friends and being forgotten in university, and also just missing my friends, and probably went back to university way too quick. The doctors at the time told me I was going back too quick. I was insistent. I wanted to do it my way. Got back to university, like still clutching my stitches, hadn't been properly removed, still had to chop up my food with scissors at the time. That's how like fragile my bowel was. And because I'd landed back into university early, which I had done for largely social reasons, my university, who had spent those 6 weeks saying, don't worry about it, it's like, you take care of your health, prioritize that, upon me arriving back at uni was like, please hand in all your deadlines within a week. 6 weeks of deadlines within 1 week, and I couldn't even walk to uni yet. I think it's in the context of that, and I think it's also in the context of university was the first time I had found safety in the people around me. I didn't have great friendship groups in school, but I was around people who made me feel comfortable and safe. And then in 3rd year, I went into a lecture, and we didn't have a lot of psychologists coming into our lecture halls to give lectures, but there was one module, and I was doing psychology as a degree, where psychologists came in, and there was one person who came in for CAMS, which is Child and Adolescent Mental Health Services. So they're working with young people. And it was a person who specifically worked in the context of hospitals. Now, this was the job I have always wanted. This was the job I was training for. I was doing this psychology degree to eventually do this job. And she had said 1 or 2 sentences as I was sitting in that lecture hall that was something along the lines of, when you see someone in a hospital bed, because they're there for physical health reasons, they don't think about the impact it has on your mental health. And they will likely respond with, I'm not crazy, I don't need to see a psychologist. Word for word what I said when I was 11 years old. And then the other thing you will majorly have to deal with is, why me? a thing I said a lot when I was 19 years old. And it was like being read in that way, in a context that I was not ready for. And then also the fact that I was trapped on a bench full of people who I did not want to see me cry. At this point in my life, I never cried. It was such a running joke with my friends that I never cried, that they sat me down and made me watch Titanic, The Notebook, and then My Girl to try to make me cry. Failed at Titanic, failed at The Notebook, and then eventually My Girl got me and I cried for the first time. But really had just like numbed myself around all this stuff to the point where, like, it's very strange saying this now because I talk about my surgeries all the time, but never really spoke about my surgeries, really struggled talking about my scars because it was associated with my surgeries. And also the fact that I really didn't talk about the details and the intricacies of my hospital experiences, and then being read next to my best guy friend who sat next to me, and I'm like tearing up. The lecturer sees me tearing up, and at the beginning of the lecture was like, I say anything that makes you uncomfortable, feel free to leave. But I was like, how the hell do I leave without asking the entire road to stand up so I can leave? And also what a big scene that would cause, that I just sat there with tears dripping down my face. And then as soon as we were getting ready to leave, I just buried my head so no one saw me and then ran out. And I remember hearing my friend behind me being like, Michelle, where the hell are you going? And like just ran out of there, locked myself in a bathroom until everyone left. And I could literally hear him be like, where did Michelle go? Like, where did she just run off to? And I proceeded to go home. I basically stayed there for about a month. Like, all I did really was like cry in my room. I stopped going to lectures. I had been having auditory hallucinations, which is when you hear voices. It was a lot of memories, couldn't sleep. And I was in shock. I had no clue what was happening. I was 19 years old, didn't really want to talk about it, and started hearing voices. When I slept at night, was imagining things, nightmares, waking up, imagining I was in the middle of surgery. And it was like all these things started back, but like logically, rationally, I didn't know why it was happening right now. Like, I'd already had all my surgeries. I hadn't had a surgery in like 6 months. And then it was one day where basically I kept hearing, all my housemates were out, and I just kept hearing this voice going like, Michelle, Michelle. And I was like, oh, now it's happening during the day. And I came out of my bedroom and realized it wasn't an auditory hallucination. It was my actual friend. It was the friend who was sat next to me in the lecture. And it took me off guard so much that I like burst out crying, and then in a like jumbled mess was like, I'm having auditory hallucinations so badly, I thought you were an auditory hallucination. And he was like, Michelle, you need help. So the following day I went to my first ever therapy appointment, and I was so scared to go, I left my keys at home. I remember that because I knew I was going to turn around if I had the option to. So my friends were very confused when they came home to me on the doorstep, and I pretended I'd left my keys at home when I definitely hadn't. I'd done it on purpose. And that's when I got told I had PTSD. And because I was quite young and I didn't know a lot about it, and yes, I was doing a psychology degree, but it's not something that had come up. The only thing I knew about PTSD was that it was for sexual assault survivors and war veterans. And so I didn't believe my trauma was great enough to warrant that label. And I fought it for months. And I ended up quitting therapy after 4 months, being like, this isn't working. This is making me worse. And I ended up finding a lot of help and resolve in something called havening, which is how I landed up becoming a life coach instead of psychologist. So I ended up graduating that year. I don't know how. I just submitted my final dissertation, got out of there as soon as I could. And when I found this guy who did havening, I was like, whatever you're trained in, I want to get qualified in. I learned through him, and what I also learned through getting qualified is life coaching and the models I'm trained in, which is neurolinguistic programming, timeline therapy, and hypnotherapy and neurolinguistic programming coaching. The point of view they come from trauma is that trauma occurs when a negative event happens in your life and you are unable to escape. So obviously in a hospital experience, you can't leave the hospital bed. All the times I've been in hospital, I have been bedridden for the majority of it. And therefore, no matter how painful it is or how much I want to be alone, I don't get that choice. When I got given that explanation, I was like, okay, that I can relate to. You can look into havening if that's the thing that works for you. And there are multiple different models on how people view trauma. And it is important to say that like life coaching and the things I'm talking about might not coexist with how traditional psychology sees trauma. Everyone views it slightly differently. And I just looked up a few of the definitions to show you the broad range of it. Even like the dictionary definition of trauma is a deeply distressing and disturbing event. Then there are also people who say life is traumatizing and that we all have trauma within us. And then there are people who are saying that we overuse the term trauma and that not everything can be called trauma because then it's demeaning for people who actually need help. Looking on some charities' websites, they say trauma can include events where you feel frightened, under threat, humiliated, rejected, abandoned, invalidated, unsafe. There is collective trauma, generational trauma, childhood trauma, racial trauma, secondary trauma. So I don't care to fight over the definition of trauma. And I also think that my knee-jerk reaction of like, I've not been through enough to warrant trauma is the same knee-jerk reaction that most people get when they reach out for help, for therapy, in terms of them saying like, well, I've not been enough to warrant help. And actually everyone deserves help. You don't need to be broken in order to get therapy. And also, if it feels traumatizing to you, then it is traumatizing. And a lot of my pushing back on that label at that time was probably a denial, because it was too big a thing. Often when I think about that diagnosis, I think if I'd been given permission to feel how I wanted to feel at the time of my surgeries, I am not sure I would have had PTSD. I can't say for certain, but what I will say is that all of the emotions that came out in a jumbled mess when I was 19 years old and like suddenly felt so overwhelmed I couldn't leave my bed and couldn't stop crying was because I had been brought up at a time where doctors and nurses and medical practitioners were so insistent on you being positive in order to survive. And as a result, I was always fed with the line of like, you're grateful, you should be lucky. Thank goodness they discovered the brain tumor, rather than just letting me be an angry 11-year-old because I'm going through my 5th major surgery in the space of 3 months while my friends are playing and having an amazing summer holiday. You're allowed to be angry about that. And if I'd been told that from a young age, I think I actually would have been able to process some of it. And I think it would have felt less traumatic at the time as well, because not only is surviving it a large task, surviving it with a smile on your face is an impossible task. And it led me to being very numb around all of my hospital experiences until that point when it all came crashing down. And when you repress all of your feelings and emotions, they pop up in a way that like you can't process them because you're trying to feel all of them at once. I use the analogy of pushing a balloon underwater, and the stronger you push the balloon underwater, the more it'll pop up with more viciousness. And I couldn't deal with one emotion because all of them were coming at me at the same time, plus all of these memories and plus all of these like voices in my head and like memories that I like, a lot of them I hadn't thought about in years. Since then, I've kind of battled with how much I identify with it, how much I think I still have PTSD, how much you can be healed from it, where you can be recovered from it. Can you be fully recovered, or are you always recovering from it? But I think I've got to a place where I'm like, the way I am today likely impacts who I am because of the trauma I've gone through. And a very small example of this is actually quite a late realization. So I'm 31 years old, and I think I realized this when I was 27 years old, where I have never liked aggressive movies. I have never liked loud movies. I consider action movies scary, and it's been a running joke with my friends, and I've always joked about it. And then I was dating someone, and it was our 5th date, and I got invited to the James Bond premiere. And this is where I would normally turn it down. But I knew he was a really big James Bond fan. And I was like, what's the worst going to happen? Now, bear in mind at this point, I don't think this is a part of my PTSD. I just think I don't like scary movies. I don't like action movies. I see them as scary movies. And we go to the IMAX theatre in Leicester Square. We're on this 5th date. And within 2 seconds, I have not just screamed really loudly in the cinema, but I fully jumped out of my seat. This happens throughout the movie. Like, the IMAX was so much worse because it was just like so much bigger, but I spent the whole movie turned around, like my back towards the screen, my head buried in his like armpit arm just so I couldn't see anything, with my fingers blocking my ears. Not the best fifth date. I walk out and it's the first time it occurs to me to mention this to my life coach. So in my next session I mention it and she was like, yeah, that will be your PTSD. When you have PTSD, you are easily dysregulated, which basically means your nervous system is usually on high alert. It means your fight, flight, freeze response is triggered more easily. And I think that's been the biggest part of my learning and experience around PTSD in the last few years, is realizing, especially through the myofascial therapy work that I'm doing, I'm seeing a myofascial therapist, and recognizing how much my body holds the trauma, is there are parts of me that, like, for example, I got invited to a Halloween party. I hate Halloween, understandably, jumpy person. Even saying I'm a jumpy person is not just James Bond. It's also being in my flat and people walking into the room. And like when I lived with someone, him being not able to understand that if he walked in too quietly, I would jump out of my skin. It's a hypervigilance that comes from PTSD. And no, it doesn't impact my life day to day. And I am capable and fine. But then when things go wrong, I probably react faster, more intensely than I would if I had zero trauma in my body. And trying to unlearn all of that and all the myofascial release work I've been doing is realizing how much physically sits in my body. And this is where, when I started learning about PTSD, it really changed how much progress I made. What didn't work for me was talking therapy. All the cerebral stuff. Talking about my memories from hospital over and over again felt like it was making it worse. At the time, I was too young to actually communicate that. I think I communicated that as much as saying, hey, I'm feeling worse after session, not better, and being told that's part of the process. But what I've since realized is therapies that are more somatic, which basically means more in your body, more feeling centered. So things like saying, okay, if you go back to your memory of you when you're 11 years old, I can feel it in my stomach right now. It's actually making me feel quite sick. It's a tightness and a ball. Being told like, okay, now breathe into it. How does it feel as you breathe into it? And then I can be like, well, it's softening, and now sit with that emotion. Let that pain come up. Let that discomfort come up. And like also stay with it long enough that it also releases. That's a lot of the work I've been doing. That's the stuff that makes it feel better, because I do believe trauma is held within the body. There's a much greater understanding around that now. That is not a new age woo-woo thing to say anymore, thanks to a number of incredible books on the topic. My favorite person around trauma is Gabor Mate. He has a number of amazing books. I think his latest one's called The Myth of Normal. But 10 years ago, to say that was very woo-woo. To say that 10 years ago was a little bit of a weird thing you had to explain to people, even when I used to say things like, you know, feelings sit in your body, right? That like when you feel sad, you actually feel that inside your body, because we had normalized only therapies which are very cerebral and talking about things. There is understanding the problem, and then there is also processing the problem. And in order to process trauma largely, you have to be within your body. And using those tools has been really important to start to lift some of it around. And I think whenever you get a diagnosis or whenever you live with something, whether it be trauma, it's a lot of unpicking and it's a lifelong process. And I think that's the point I'm at. So I want to also share a few ways where I've been able to move forward. But first, we're going to have one of your voice notes. And for the record, if you ever want to send a voice note in, you are always welcome to on any topic. Send an email to inallhonesty@mindsetforlife.co.uk. And so if you ever have a question, send it my way. Make sure it's a voice note. It can be anonymous. And I'd love to hear from you.
Hi Michelle, thanks so much for your brilliant podcast. And I'm also reading your book at the moment and I am loving it. So thank you very much. My question for you is about a difficult family situation that happened quite a few months ago now. I had a bit of a fallout with my fiance's brother's girlfriend. Now, in the months before this fallout, we'd actually become really quite close. We messaged almost every single day. We'd got to know each other quite well, and we were in a really good place. However, in the past, there had been a few fallouts where she had behaved in quite a tricky way. And this most recent fallout was secondary to me making a mistake, which I apologised for, held myself accountable for, and learnt from. But in doing so, she also made some really hurtful comments about my personality. Given that, and given that she'd hurt me in the past, I decided to essentially limit my contact with her. This was before I'd done any work on boundaries, so I don't think I've done it in the best way. Although at the time I'd made my feelings about the situation very clear, and I'm really proud of how I reacted initially. Like, I definitely didn't say anything that I regret. But what I do regret is not saying that I was going to keep my distance. We're a few months on now, and I don't know whether this is worth bringing it up again. She's still not apologised. She's also been distanced from me. So I don't really know. I don't know if it's been too long to explain why I've been taking some time away just to kind of process my feelings, and because she's hurt me a few times, or whether I should just leave it. I was just looking for what your thoughts were on that situation, and I'd be really grateful for any help. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much for that voice note. I think it's really interesting because it's so much harder to set the boundaries when you know you're in the wrong. And I actually learnt this from someone else. So I remember I was in a fight with a partner at the time, and we were talking about something that he had done. He had lied about a COVID test, and he had said he was negative when he wasn't negative, and I was really upset knowing with my chronic health conditions that he took that risk, and it turns out he was negative anyway, but I still didn't like the lying, and I was really annoyed about it, and I think it had flared up a lot of my PTSD, ironically given the title of the episode, of feeling more under threat than I was. And he said, I understand I'm in the wrong. I completely put my hands up, and I understand why you're upset. And also, you're taking this too far. I had a real respect for it, because you can say, hey, I'm in the wrong. And also, the names you are using right now and the words you are calling me isn't acceptable and isn't okay. On the point of, should you bring it up? I don't believe there is ever a deadline or a time limit where you can't bring something up at a later date. If that person has accepted the distance without any confusion, then I think it's okay to leave that distance. But the reason why I would say you should bring it up isn't because about the distance, but more so because it sounds like you're still upset about it. And I always have this thing where I say, if you can't let it go, then you have to bring it up. And I think you've already worked on trying to let it go, and it's not worked. And if you are distancing as a conscious thing, that's one thing. But then to distance because you're scared of a person and how they're going to react, I think if you do bring it up, you need to prepare yourself for greater insults, but that you might actually be proud of yourself for standing up for yourself and having your own back in being able to say, hey, that name you called me wasn't okay. And I would really appreciate apology, and it would really help me rebuild our relationship if you can just acknowledge how I felt in that moment. I appreciate I was in the wrong. I understand you are upset. And also, it's not okay to speak to people like that. And being told that might make her back go up. There's this thing that I refer to a lot called the boundary backlash. Like, she might say you're being difficult, you're being annoying, all of these things, like call you names. And if she does, it's on her. You know that this was going to happen. You prepare for it by knowing that this is predictable behavior and that people largely run their patterns and it is not personal. And also then you know that you made the right decision. And if the consequence of that is greater distancing, then so be it. I think we have to not be worried about the outcome of setting our boundaries enough that we don't set our boundaries. And yes, the fallout of it might be greater insults, but if you're still holding on to it and still holding on a little bit of a flame, a little bit of a hope, a little bit of a candle of just being able to have her in your life in some capacity, I think it needs to be resolved. And I think you carrying it around still feels like a weight. And I think this is where we sometimes have an illusion that ignoring a conversation or burying it under the carpet is the more comfortable and safe solution. It might be the more familiar solution, but if it's still bothering you and it's still in your mind, it's still in your body. And therefore, there will be discomfort whenever you're around her presence. And so I do encourage you to bring it up. If you don't think you're mentally in the stable enough place to handle more insults, then maybe not right now. But the next time you're feeling secure and steady in your own life and you're finding that, oh, actually, I'm not able to let it go, then it's your duty to yourself to bring it up. I hope that helps. And I'm so glad my books have helped you as well. Back to trauma. What a funny intro. So when it comes to trauma, one of the things that has really helped me is, there's that saying, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. No, what doesn't kill you leaves you traumatized. When people say you've dodged a bullet, I didn't dodge it. It went straight through me and I might not be bleeding anymore, but I definitely have the scars and wounds from it. I think this illusion that you leave the hospital bed healed when actually no, the moment you leave the hospital bed is the moment the healing begins. I think we have such a greater awareness of trauma, and rather than focusing on the nitpicking of like who has trauma and who doesn't, I think it's more about validating everyone's experience and the pain that people have so they don't need to exaggerate or amplify their pain. I often say you should pay attention to someone when they say they're angry before they start yelling, and equally you should pay attention to people when they are sad before they start crying. We often wait until our emotions are so extreme in a bundle, in a knot, and all landing together before actually just acknowledging it when the first drop hit. And if I'm able to go back to when I was 7 years old and for someone to just say to me, you're allowed to be angry right now, I think it would have saved me a lot of heartache in the long run. And I think it's also this toxic positivity mentality leads to a lot of us being more traumatized, because what ends up happening by telling someone they should be grateful or feel lucky is actually you're invalidating the way they do actually feel. And giving someone permission to have their full range of emotions, that actually is what gave me the permission. That label gave me the permission to accept that what I had been through was a big deal. And that it's not normal to be through the number of surgeries I've been through. And being realistic, I shouldn't have survived what I went through. If I was born 5 years earlier, I wouldn't have survived those 15 surgeries. The only reason I survived is because I have the level of financial privilege that my parents were able to fly me to the only person who knew how to fix me when I was 1 year old. That is such a niche case that actually, yes, there is some privilege and awe in the fact that I was able to survive, but also being able to live through those things leaves you with marks, and being able to talk about it and vocalize it. What's funny is that a lot of my career started around body image, around scars. But what I realized is that I found talking about scars so easy the moment I got comfortable talking about my trauma and got comfortable talking about surgeries. The issue with trauma is that there is so much shame built in, and shame breeds silence. And then you stay quiet about all the things you've gone through. So for anyone going through trauma, here are the things I would tell you. 1, talk to someone about it. Even if you talk about it in a clumsy way, even if you don't know how to articulate it, the only way you get better at talking about it is by talking about it more. The other thing I would say is look into somatic processes. If you cannot afford it, there are a number of really great resources online. One of my favorite tips and tools that I use is called TRE, trauma releasing exercises. You can find videos on YouTube where you can do it. And it basically comes from the idea that when a tiger is being chased in the wild, or any animal being chased in the wild, and they are finally safe and they are no longer in threat, what the body does is it completely shakes to let out all of that adrenaline, cortisol rushing through their body. Because as humans, we have a conscious mind, we often re-traumatize ourselves because every time we retell the story of our trauma, our body relives that trauma. And so we need to learn how to shake it out. So trauma releasing exercises are really good for that. But also learning more about somatic processes of actually knowing how to feel your feelings in your body and be present in that. Don't get me wrong, when you first do it, it is uncomfortable as hell and you will want to run away from it. But then there is the relief that comes. And this is where you might need more support doing it for the first time so that you have people around you who can help you and tell you when to tap out, because jumping in the deep end with any of that stuff can be re-traumatizing. But I also think it's about baby stepping it, getting curious about it, learning about it, even if you're not doing any of the exercises yourself. And I think if you are one of the people who's already been diagnosed with PTSD, one of the elements I had a lot of shame around is like having trauma in your body makes you very sensitive to the world around you. We live in a world that encourages us to be numb, and being sensitive, especially when you're a woman, is seen as a bad thing. But your sensitivity is not a bad thing. It's just a difference to the other people around you. And it makes you more conscious of the people around you. And so there are negative traits and there are positive traits with any element of a person's personality. And so some of the things around your sensitivity could be that you overreact. And some of the traits around your sensitivity could mean that you're more empathetic than most people. So don't see it just as the bad side of sensitivity, because yes, being a sensitive person can be very inconvenient at times, but that doesn't mean it's only bad. And focusing on the negative traits it brings to your life means that you're not paying attention to the positive traits. This is probably one of the first of many episodes I'll do talking about trauma. And if you have a number of questions coming out of this episode, absolutely send it my way and I'll talk more about it. It was just more so that I realized I've actually probably never given you the background or the history of when I talk about me having PTSD. And yeah, let's see this as an intro episode. As we end every episode with something we are working on or learning about, I have had a highly dysregulated week. A number of things happened where I felt I was being attacked even when I wasn't. For example, bumping into an ex-best friend for the first time yesterday since the breakup, unexpectedly, which completely took me off guard. And as a result, I don't have a lot of energy. And today I was recording 2 podcast episodes. And as I was getting ready to leave, I recognized that there was this automatic thing I do when I go to record a podcast where I go to put makeup on as if I have to, as if someone's told me to. And no one's told me to. And I don't put makeup on to record my Instagram videos. When I did YouTube, my YouTube videos, I don't necessarily put makeup on to give public speaking talks or to go on radio or to go on live TV. Obviously, with some live TV programs, they have a makeup artist there, and I will never say no to a makeup artist. But me doing my makeup is not a thing I enjoy. So if someone else can do it for me, absolutely, I'll take it. And so I just had a moment where I never want to be a person when it comes to makeup where I feel like I need it. And so my micro challenge this morning was I was like, okay, I'm going to go in. I mean, it was a 2-second decision. I was like, yeah, I'm going to go in without makeup today. And it wasn't a thing. No one's commented on it. And I think sometimes going makeup free is this really built up decision in our head. And because I'm makeup free so often, it's not for me. But I wanted to vocalize that in case you are one of those people who feels like you need makeup to either be presentable or professional or do your job better, or that people are going to question your qualifications if you don't look a certain way, or that you need to look a certain way in order to be able to be listened to. All of it is bullshit. Turn up how you want. If a man turned up to an office without any makeup, no one would comment, and therefore you have that right too. That's where I'm going to leave it for today. I just want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for every person who's listened to this podcast. I love making this podcast and I really appreciate it. So if you enjoy listening, it would mean the world if you could actually hit follow and subscribe. It also means that when the episode is released, it will land straight on your phone and you don't need me reminding you on social media that a new episode has come out. And as always, if you have any feedback on the podcast or want to let me know about how it's going or what you want me talking more about, I'm over on Instagram and TikTok and all the places that you know where to find me. And just have a lovely week and I'll see you next Tuesday.